Opacity versus flow. When you start using the brush inside of Photoshop, it's always a bit confusing to understand the difference between opacity and flow. So today we are going to jump into Photoshop and I'm going to explain this difference the best I can. When you start using Photoshop, it's a bit confusing to make the difference between opacity and flow, and usually when you are a beginner, you just do what the tutorial tells you to do. So if someone tells you to use a 10% flow, you are going to use a 10% flow without thinking too much or without understanding why. And I will tell you, most of people don't even know why they are using flow or opacity. And I'm going to explain what is the difference, but what is very important is to know how it works and then decide what is best for you and what you prefer to use, knowing what is the difference between the two. So on the upper part, you can see a brush stroke with a 10% opacity. On the lower part, here you can see a brush stroke on a 10% flow. So you can see that there is a difference, and flow is more intense than opacity. So now I'm going to explain you what is the difference between opacity and flow. So now I know that we are here on photography channel, but here you're gonna have to think about painting. Photoshop has a lot of similarities with paintings, and here we are on a canvas, like you could have a physical canvas in front of you, and we are using a brush like you could have a brush on your hand and brushing physically on the canvas. And here is going to be important to have this painting idea in mind, so it will help you to understand what is the difference between opacity and between flow. So think about flow as how fast the paint comes out of your brush, affecting how much color builds up with each stroke. While opacity is like how see-through the paint is, determining how much of what's underneath shows through, which actually makes sense if you are really thinking about it. It's when you want to see something underneath the layer where you want to change the opacity. While flow, so as I just said before, this is how fast the paint comes out of your brush. So imagine you have paint on your brush, and the percentage of flow is going to tell you how much paint you're gonna have on the canvas. So this is why there is more intensity in flow than in opacity. So here is the theory, now let's see in practice. So as you can see, 10% opacity here on top will be less intense than 10% flow. Now in practice, I'm gonna still use the flow on the lower part and opacity on the upper part. So here in practice, if I do a 10% flow brush stroke and then without lifting my pen, I'm going to brush again. And you're gonna see that at some point, because it's building up, I'm gonna arrive at 100% effect. Even though we are at 10% flow, if I keep brushing on it, we're gonna have a 100% effect. Now let's see what is the difference with a 10% opacity. So I'm gonna do my stroke, and I'm not going to lift my pen. And you can see that we can't get 200% effect if I don't lift my brush. We will still have a 10% opacity. And now I'm going to do the same thing, but by lifting and brushing again and again and again on the same line, but by lifting my pen every time. And like that, I can eventually arrive at 100% effect. So here's the thing now in photography. If you are trying to build something or to create an effect where you need really a subtle effect and you need it to be very controlled, I would recommend to use the opacity. So you know that if you don't lift your brush, the effect will be exactly the same, you won't have any problem. Well, if you use flow and by mistake you brush where you have already brushed before, it's going to add up on it. So that will be less controlled. Usually this is why in skin retouching we prefer to use opacity than flow, so it's more controlled, especially when you are doing a dodge and burn. Now, for example, in travel photography, I use flow to create glow because I like to be brushing again and again on the same stroke until I like the effect. So even though I might use a 3% flow, I know that on some part of the image, I will like to brush again and the effect will be stronger. So it really depends on what you want to work on. So now let's see in practice. For example, while using a technique called dodge and burning, I would always use the opacity instead of flow. So I'm going to show you why and what is the difference. So for example here, so I take my brush beyond my keyboard and I have a 10% flow. Here I want to darken here the foreground, so I'm going to brush black. I am brushing. And I only have to focus on what area I want to target. And even though you can see I've been brushing several times at the same place, it didn't add more intensity because I didn't lift my pen. So you can see here, I'm going to add more contrast so you can see better. You can see that the intensity of the shadow here is the same everywhere. Even though I've been brushing several times at the same time, this is because I use the opacity parameter and not the flow. Let's do exactly the same with the flow. So I'm gonna do exactly the same because we know that intensity is more intense than opacity. I'm going to use here like 4% flow instead of 10 in opacity, and let's do it. I've been doing exactly the same with flow on a dodge and burn layer, but because I've been brushing several times on the same place, this is stronger in some parts and less strong in other parts. Because with flow, if you are brushing on the same space several times, it will add intensity, even though I didn't lift my brush. So here on a dodge and burn technique, I needed to be very controlled, so I would use opacity and let the flow at 100% and not touching it. Now let's see another technique where we could eventually use flow. That would be to fill the mask, for example. So here I'm going to do something very quick. For example, adding an adjustment. And let's say I'm making a selection. And now I want to quickly fill this selection. So there is two techniques to be very quick. Command delete. And it will fill with one of the active color. But here we want to use the brush, so I have my brush 100% flow, and here I quickly brush, and because I am on 100% flow, that will be very quick. I can brush several times and that will be gone. That will be 100% black, and that's what we want. So here is one of the reasons I would rather use flow. Then a reason why I like to use flow is when I want to add glow on one image. So here I'm at the 3% flow set on an overlay mode, and here I'm going to brush, and if I think that the effect is not strong enough, let me change my color quickly. If I think that the effect is not strong enough, I only have to brush again. And I don't necessarily have to lift my pen like I would have to do with the opacity. So here you can see I'm just brushing again and again until I like the glowing effect. So I have a tutorial about how to add glow that will be more precise. Here I'm just showing you quickly how flow is working and not really how to create glow effect on a photo. So you can see before and after, and I use the flow on my brush to control how much glow I wanted. So to wrap up, if you need something very controlled, use the opacity, and if you want to build up the effect quickly, use the flow, and you won't have to lift your pen to make the effect stronger with more intensity. I hope that you now understand the difference between flow and opacity. If you learned something in this video, please push the like buttons and comment something, it always helps my channel to grow. And don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.